Hi and welcome back. So in today's lesson, we're going to take a look at, in this lecture, light, value, edges, contrasts as it applies to drawing the human figure. Now I've done one of these before. It's in the basic section, basic drawing, and it's relevant to what we're doing with the figure. So if you're kind of skipping ahead and you're not sure about these concepts, you might want to go back and take a look at that one as it applies to more simplified forms, because now we're going to be talking about and utilizing these four aspects as it applies to the human figure. So we're going to start out with light. We're going to talk about the different light sources and direction of light you can have. Then we're going to move to value and quickly into the value scale, which most of you should know at this point in time, which are essentially light and dark relationships in our case in terms of drawing a two-dimensional surface. And then also edges, the importance of edges. The big key there is the difference between a form shadow edge, a cast shadow edge, a boundary of an object, a molecular ending, if you will, of an object that gives us a harder, crisper edge versus smooth transitions, overlapping of forms, which is going to be very important to get those differentiations, of edges. And then lastly, contrast of all of these elements. Most people think it's just in terms of value, but it could be contrast of light, and then of course contrast of edges, and much more. So that's what we're going to go for with this particular lecture only. There won't be really any drawing in this particular one. This video is meant to prep you for the next stages of the progression of drawing the figure, which are the lay-in, the shadow linear lay-in, and the block and the mop in coarse shadow, and so on. So we'll get there in just a little bit of time. All right, let's go on now and talk about light and value. All right, so let's talk a little bit about now properties of light before we get to the figures. So let's do a formal review. So you may remember this image from our basic drawing section, and it's worth going back over because we're going to utilize some of these images that I'm going to show you in addition to and connecting them to the figure. So we'll start with light and properties of light. You've really got, with light, you've got a range of options with light sources and directions. So with this little ball I've got drawn here, I'm perceiving the light source as more artificial, and so it's lit by a bulb, tungsten light or LED light now, or a fluorescent bulb, if you will, and all the other different kind of bulbs you can think of. But it is artificial light, so we have the luxury of that. So we have to think about the light source. So it could be artificial, it could be natural, which could be sunlight in most cases, moonlight, or candlelight, which I'll call a more natural surface, wax, or a lantern we'll call a more natural surface, or a light material actually. And so that you've got these two different ranges, and probably the biggest difference between artificial lighting, electric lighting, if you will, or LED, and in most cases sunlight, is the difference between subtle softness and more harsh contrast. With artificial lighting, which we use mostly in art schools, which has been the case now for probably almost 80 years, or probably from the real invent of electricity and the probably post-World War II era, 40s, late 40s and beyond, has been artificial light, because you can control it better, and you get some clearer definition of shadows. With sunlight, you're going to be softer and more supple, which can be beautiful certainly as well, but it's going to move on you after every 30 minutes or so on a clearer day. Sometimes with northern lighting, it's cloudy. That's even better. You get more of a diffused situation. But we use mostly artificial light. I certainly do in my classrooms here at NKU. And then you have to think about direction of light. So the direction of light of this sphere is coming higher and slightly from behind and to the left. So up high, slightly from the side, or maybe slightly from behind and to the left. We see where the light shines here, and then we see the cast shadow moving a little bit in this direction. So we can tell that the light source will be opposite of that object. Now we have in review here our 6 properties of light, and I have them numerically aligned with the list on the other side. And just going in order, the first is highlight. That's going to be your brightest, hottest area of light. That's going to be receiving from the light source, in this case a bulb or a lamp, onto the object at about 45 degrees. So it's reflected right back to us at 45 degrees. Then next, all this material out here is light, form, shadow. It's not the highlight, but it's this corona out in this area, which is going to give us number 2, which is our lighter form shadow. It's not highlight per se. That's the only thing on the drawing in the lighting situation that's going to be absolute light, as the highlight. 2 will be just slightly darker, so we call it light form shadow. As we move further away out from the highlight, getting into the softer, subtle ranges of the lighter side of the object, we call those dark form shadows. So in this particular area where I've got rendering of light, and then that tone of the paper starts to emerge on its own as a mid-tone value, that's our dark form shadow. Darker form shadow. That can get a little confusing because we're still ultimately in the light. Now, my favorite shadow, and the one that gives us quite a bit of movement or turn in three-dimensionality, is the core shadow. Now the core shadow at 4 is that shadow that terminates from the light to the dark, and it's a band in between that area where the light ends and the shadow begins. The core shadow emerges. Now the core shadow is the darkest part of our shadow on the form, and I love it because it gives us that three-dimensional pop, or that illusion, that character of three-dimensionality, turning of form, whether it's a ball or a box or a hand or a foot or a torso or an abdomen. It gives us that wonderful change. And what I love about it so much is also, once we start defining the core shadow, after our block in, it also helps us define more fully the reflected light back in here on number 5. So number 5 is created all through here where my dots are, even behind this core shadow. It's lighter than the core shadow, and it's being reflected from the line off of the exterior outside surface back onto the object. And we'll see that with the figure being reflected back and giving us that soft, shadowy glow on the backside of the shadow. We don't see that with the moon. That's why we see the moon as a fingernail kind of white shape, crescent shape, because there's nothing large enough next to the moon to bounce light off of back onto the moon to give us reflected light. So we have core shadow, reflected light, and then lastly cast shadow, which is the shadow shape, the harder edge shadow shape being created from the light source onto the object, and the object blocks enough of that light to give us this wonderful harder edged cast shadow shape, which is going to be quite dark the closer it is to the object itself. Notice how it runs right into this nice curve in through here, so it touches where the ball touches. There's absolute dark in through here, then it fades a little bit. We get more light in through here, and we get some reflected light, and it eases up. As a matter of fact, as the shadow pushes longer it will start to, the edge of this will start to fade a little bit and get a little bit softer. And we'll talk about these edge differences even further in a moment as we get to the figure. But with form shadows, notice everything across this ball is softer transitions, right? And everything in terms of the cast shadow is a much crisper, harder edge, as well as the boundary, the molecular boundary of any object, whether it's a ball or it's a human breast or it's a hand or a finger, toe, whatnot. It's going to get a crisper, harder edge. And managing those edges is going to be very important. This is a much softer edge here where my arrow is, the form shadow, in the core shadow, and all these transitions, than those boundary edges. All right, so let's go take a look now at value in a value scale in relationship to this sphere, and I think we'll be well prepped up to go into the figure after that. All right, so now we're going to combine value in the value scale that we have below. We're going to do this quickly so we can get on with the figure, as this is just really a review. We're going to combine the value scale and see how value and then light up here in the value scale work together even though they're different. Remember that light are properties of light that illuminate an object, and value, down here the value scale from, in this case, 1 to 10, or you can go 0 to 10 or 0 to 11, or you could quite frankly go from 0 to 100,000 and get all the nuances of a value scale, but generally a 1 to 10 works pretty well. How they work together. So value can be very flat. The quantification of a range of lights and darks, right, in a scale with 10% differences and jumps. How can that work with properties of light when we look at the value within the ranges of the light situation that we have on? So if we have, and think about a highlight as the brightest part in through here, generally that's going to be in our value scale down through here. So we're going to have that highlight in this area, the hottest, brightest part of an object will be in the highlight. It'll be in the ones area. Later on it could be 2s and 3s depending on your value key if you're darker. But in this case that's where it relates to. So we're in the 1 area of our value range here. As we move outward now to core shadow from the highlight, we're going to fall into these ranges of value. We're going to fall into 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s, and 6s as we move through the value in the light on our object. So from the highlight here over to probably core shadow is going to be roughly right in through this area on our scale, and then on our object we're going to see that 8s and 9s for a core shadow is probably, for a pretty well illuminated contrasty drawing or figure drawing, it's going to be in the 8 or 9 section, and everything else from 8s and especially 7s to 1 or 2 are going to be light form shadow. So I'll just put LFS in through here, and then of course darker form shadow. As we move across that ball, it's getting somewhat darker, that smoother transition across the ball until we get to that core shadow, and it's of course still smooth, but it gets demonstrably darker, doesn't it? And then we get into reflected light, and what you notice about reflective light, that it's somewhat lighter than our core shadow. So in the 8 range, so reflected light's here and here, right, in here, in these ranges, but it's got to be lighter than our core shadow. But reflected light generally is still going to be darker than anything on the lighter side of the object. So if our reflected light is here, it's got to be at least 2 or 3 steps in value darker than what's over here in our value range, and that's why we want to quantify that. So our core shadow is the great separator. So again, the point being that our reflected light will always be a little bit darker than anything on the lighter side. Core shadow will always be the darkest. Now, there are exceptions to that rule with double direct lining, but we're not going to get into that discussion. That's a more advanced kind of technique, but you can see reflected light as the direct lighting on the other side. That means that we have direct lighting really on the reflected light. There wouldn't be much reflected light, so we want to be careful of that. The point being here is that value down here, a value scale, is a flatter concept in a separate concept of light and dark relationships, and then properties of light over here are a illuminating concept that works across the universe on objects in terms of illuminating with the properties of light with a single light source on an object. That will be true of one singular light source like the sun on a planet or a moon or a rock, etc. And of course, we have light sources in objects that we draw, so they will all work together. So this unity, this harmony between these two different concepts of value and light work together. And now we can start to take a look at how light, value, edges, and contrasts work together with the figure. Let's take a look at that now. Now we get to take a look at light, value, edges, contrasts, and the figure. So what I've got popped up now is the drawing here on the far left by Pierre-Paul Prud'hon, and an French academic drawing here, 19th century, I believe, and then a close-up here in the center here. So we've got the drawing here, then a close-up here, and then of course the light, properties of light image over here, and then we've got our value scale over here, and then of course we'll talk about edges too as well. So we can see these simple, more basic concepts as relative ideas and concepts for rendering light and value and form and three-dimensionality and reality right on a drawing surface to make it look, or to make it come alive and look believable and dimensionable. Okay, it's not about style. We're not talking about style, although this is more in the more academic traditional realm, but this can apply to more impressionistic type of ideas. But we're not talking about style. We want to be more concrete right now and just talk about the concept specifics of some of these of light, value, and edges contrast. So let's start here with the image now on the far left with Pierre-Paul Prud'hon. So we've got what looks to be at his time still probably natural lining, probably northern face lining, and we notice which way is the light source coming from? It's coming from the top right, shining down on the model and somewhat in front of the model. And the reason why we know that, take a look at the edge in the angle here of the cast shadow is slightly going back to the right. So the light source is above, slightly in front of the model, above, right, in natural, more than likely natural, and then pushed a little bit in front of to the model as well. So we have connected now the direction of our light source, and we are pretty sure then also that our light source is what it is, which is natural, not artificial. And so now we can jump in and analyze what's going on with these particular forms. So I think it's really crystal clear to see in both the enlarged image here and the smaller image, the light side of the model here, right, and the shadow side back here. So we've separated light and dark quickly. And what separates that junction, that border between light and dark, is going to be that beautiful turn of core shadow. So number 4 on our properties of light, there it is right there, that beautiful band of value, that darker value, right? And then where is that darker value? Over here it's somewhere between 9 and 10. So everything is a little bit more now on the darker side of the value scale somewhat. So it's a little bit more in a kind of a darker room or vacuum. That's kind of the way I read it. What about edges? Notice the edges of the coarse shadow, soft transitions from the dark coarse shadow outward into the light, and also a soft transition here from the coarse shadow into the blocked in tone, which becomes reflected light. Both of these, here and here, and all the way through, this beautiful snaking kind of striped shape has a very blurred image or very blurred edge on both sides. Coarse shadow has to be soft. Mine's a little bit harder here, but it's still soft enough here and also here back on the ball to show a soft form shadow transition, which have to show soft edges. So we've begun to now accurately analyze what's going on with the drawing after the coarse shadow. Let's stay in the shadow and look at what's going on in the model. All of this now, shadow, here I am on the left, all of this mostly, this lighter illumination, which is in the 7s and 8 and 6 range of reflected light. I'll put R and L for reflected light, are in the 6, 7, and 8 value range. It's being reflected off the podium that she's leaning on, off the room, the backdrop, the ground, etc., and reflecting back on and illuminating. The brightest part, kind of the highlight of the reflected light, is more or less right in through the lower middle back region, right in through here. And that's probably no lighter or darker than somewhere between 5 and 6. That's about as light as he'll want to get. But we see other value ranges. We see 8s here. We see 7s in through here. Of course, we see the 5 there, 6s and 7s throughout the back. The buttock is about a 7 in through there. And so we can quantify all these little value shifts, these really subtle shifts, back down, of course, into now our value scale. But ultimately, from 5 or 6 onward to 8, 9, and 10, that's the shadow side. So I'll put SS for shadow or SSH for shadow side. Well, what about these little dark values in the crevasse of the buttock, the split here, the leg? What's going on in through here? And then what about this value and the type of shadow that we have here? Those are cast shadows. Those cast shadows are cast from this leg, the right leg here, onto the left leg. And it's deeply in shadow. So we're going to get cast shadows that hover in 8s and more into the 10. Notice the cast shadow here. So the closer it gets to the form itself, the overlapping of the form in the space in between, we see cast shadowing in this line, elegant line here, underneath here a little bit, we get very dark shadows. Edges are still pretty crisp. This cast shadow edge of the model onto the podium is a pretty hard edge. Look at the hard edge right here onto the arm from the abdomen. That's a cast shadow, a harder edge, while the shadow side here, this edge and this edge is pretty soft. So let's go down to the bottom left image here. Look at the cast shadow down here, harder edged, which also gave us the direction of the shadow. And the opposite of that would be the light source. So these harder edge boundaries versus these soft edge transitions. And here's another cast shadow on the calf right there, that little harder banded edge from this calf onto that one gives us this nice, beautiful control of clarity and reality. And when you get your edges and your value and your light situations working, you get crystal clear clarity. And so if you're having trouble with your drawings, it's somewhere between the contrasts of your light situations, your value ranges, right, and your edge control. Okay, that's not to mention proportion, scale, anatomy, volume, and all that, but we're talking more when you illuminate the figure. Now, on to the light. So the light source is top right and a little bit in front of her. The highlights happen on the shoulder. It's about 45 degrees right in through here. They happen a little bit of the forehead right in through here. So in the ear, in the curl of the hair. So we're probably 1s and 2s on the value scale right in through there. As we move off of the 1s right here, okay, the highlight, into here, this section, through the glute, the trochanter area, and back across. What does that remind you of? It reminds you, hopefully, of the same thing coming across here. We're now in light form shadow and darker form shadow coming across the model, darker form shadow right in through here. Okay, and our value range is about the 3, 4, and maybe the 5 range. So we have this is interesting, this value right here, right in there, is about the same as that value. But look how this looks like a highlight over here, or a lighter area, and this is darker. It's the relative position of where these values relate to one another that make them what they are and make the lighting situation illuminate. That's very important. So we have highlight, lighter form shadows, darker form shadows, core shadow, reflected light. We have a boundary edge of the buttock, that's a hard edge, a cast shadow, more reflected light, and then we have a boundary edge of the buttock here. Hard edges, crisp edges, boundary of the buttock, boundary of the leg or the hip, boundary of the leg, elbow, boundary here, a boundary on the outside, versus all the soft transitions going on the inside make this drawing believable. It comes alive, it's illuminated, and the drawing is crystal clear. And that's what we're looking for. Let's go on to one more image, and then you can start in on drawing, and we'll look at lay-in versus block-in. So let's look at one more by Prud'hon. Last image to look at, this is Prud'hon, another academic drawing by Prud'hon, charcoal and a little white chalk, and it's blended together. Beautiful, elegant drawing with some nice sketchier qualities in the leg and in the back of the arm, so you can see where his rougher lay-ins have been. He did multiple layers of these and then blended them in to get this smooth surface. So it's a wonderful drawing to look at for also just drawing technique and texture as well. So let's analyze now what's going on with the light. The light situation is above. We know that it's illuminated at the top parts of the image, top of the leg here, right? But we see this shadow, cast shadow shape coming down and back a little bit, hovering over here, a cast shadow here. So the light source is slightly in front of the object and well from above, probably also natural northern light of some sort, either cloudy, meaning either cloudy or sunlight. So it was definitely sunlight, but we don't know if it was a cloudy or sunny day here. So we have that located and now thought through, and let's take a look at the light, and let's look at value, and let's look at edges and those contrasts. So we see that starting lovely, the separation of the shadow side here, right over here, so shadow side here, and then the light side here by that lovely core shadow. So here's the core shadow. We're a little bit lighter here with our core shadows, probably somewhere in 7s and 8s, 7.5 with our core right in through there. Of course, we see that banded quality, that stripe-like quality, really really well on the elbow, coming down to the deltoid, the shoulder, over the abdomen, the belly region, lower back, buttock, and down to the knee and onto the calf, and a little bit onto the bulge of the calf. And through here we see core shadow also through here. Remember, edge quality, soft and blended on both sides, blended into the light, blended into the reflected light. Great area right in through here. We see it blended and blended here. That doesn't mean you have to blend it with your fingers or your hands. The edge has to be soft. It's a form shadow, and it's got to be a little bit blurry. Same thing is happening on the breast. The breast is a good place to look at right in through here because we see core shadow. Look at the core shadow over here on the ball. Reflected light underneath, right? And then ending of the form here as it attaches to the pectoral and the rib cage, and we get this beautiful cast shadow underneath. What are the values that make up that? Well, we've got 7s and 8s for the core shadow. Reflected lights are 5 and 6, and the cast shadow goes back to about a 7 or an 8. So the core shadow in this case and the cast shadow are pretty close, and we have our darker core shadows on the main part of the form of the model. Again, edge quality and edge control, boundary of the object, the molecular ending of a form here with the breast form here, nipple form, right? All of that is going to be a harder, crisper edge, and then the relative softness that happens through the transitions of the bodily form. Even the abdomen to the hip gets a little bit slightly stronger edge with value, but it's still relatively soft. Now, over here we have a harder edge for the pectoral and the clavicle, and we have a little harder edge for the arm as well, overlapping into the armpit area, pectoral coming down, and a little bit more the lat, as well as the teres major coming over. And then of course we get a boundary edge on this side, and of course the elbow. Those are harder edges, but in between all of these transitions from core shadow to reflected light are soft transitions until we get to the spine. Notice how this is a little bit darker in value. So we're at reflected light, which is about 6 or 7. But then on the other side, in that little crevasse where the spine is, we get a little bit darker, probably 8. And we get a little bit of a harder edge. But because the spine is a divot and not a boundary, form boundary edge, that edge, I'm right over here, that edge right here cannot be too hard. Then this edge right here, that's your harder edge, where the rib cage ends, the lats begin, and then the arm will begin. Of course, we get a harder edge with the arm and the elbow as well. So you can see how complex that can get, combining light, properties of light, value, a value scale, hard edges, right? Hard edge boundary versus soft edges all through here, right? Versus overlapping. Look how this leg overlaps. Look at this hard edge of this right leg here against the other leg. That's a hard edge boundary, but everything else is soft. Once you get these together, the image gets clear. Hard edge here, soft edges around the calf. What kind of edge is this right here? It's a form shadow. The light source is from above, shining down on this calf. The calf bulges outward, so this becomes a bulkier object like an egg form, and it creates a core shadow, reflected light. And then because it dips in, the bulge of the calf is creating a cast shadow on the ankle, and that becomes a little harder edged. Once you learn to manage these over time, your drawings will become clearer and readable, and they will improve, and they will all come together with all the other aspects of figure drawing. All right, so that's light, value, edges, and contrasts with the figure. Hope you enjoyed it, and good luck with our next phases.